And as the walls came tumbling down, so Presbycast begins again for another weekly cycle of our strange, well, I don't know, it used to be a strange corner in the internet, and then kind of to be an angry one. I don't know. I think we're sort of in this like weird hybrid area, but it is officially the dumbest part of any 4-year cycle. Things will probably only get dumber from here on out. And then once that's done, we've got General Assembly next summer. So we're still gonna be here. Hopefully, you did your reading assignments, which in our comments. So if you're on YouTube watching live, thank you for doing so. You can kind of pick stuff up, try to highlight things along as we go. Or if you are just listening on demand, thanks for doing so. We've got a pretty stacked little show that we like to call Presbycast here. Some recurring call-in guests, if that's what you could call it. Recidivism is what you would call at an all-time high whenever we do one of these episodes. So people just keep on coming in, and as we have not sold out to Spotify yet, all of our content remains solely ours to curate. So we're Presbycast. I'm Presbyterian. Chortles Weekly is here, and well, what's going on, man?
Well, we've got friends on the line, and we've got others that'll be joining us lately. Sort of a current event show, but it's got a, very ecclesial flavor, as usual. I was thinking earlier tonight, maybe we'll ask Miles this later. Seems like there are maybe 4 dimensions in our church Reformed orbits. There's the theological, the sociological, the ecclesiological, and the ideological. And I guess ideological is sort of the collision of politics with church life. And, politics seems to be pretty much colliding with everything now, doesn't it?
Yeah, I was just my wife, Mrs. Resby, as it says on her birth certificate. She and I were watching Netflix over the weekend, and we watched a little movie called Enola Holmes, which is sort of a spinoff of the Sherlock and Mycroft Holmes family. And it had a really heartwarming story. And the moral of the story was it is perfectly acceptable to abandon a member of your family if your politics are right. And I was just like, man, like this is something they should show this in schools. They should base catechisms on this because really it was the epitome of the message of what we're going through. It was basically like, if your heart's in the right place, do it. But instead, it was abandoning your family and leaving them no reason to understand where you are or really why you even had to do this. But the politics were right. So I'm glad that we can have that reinforced for $7.99 a month.
All right, well, we've got a full board, as they say in the radio industry, so let's go ahead and get to people. We'll do a quick run through. And we're probably going to have a guest, Miles, for about 30 minutes, and then if anyone who wants to hang on, we'll get back to them. But I think we're not going to go first come, first served. We're going to go ladies first. And one of our online Twitter friends, is it Petite Charette? Is she with us? All right, we're not hearing her. We'll
Can
take her out. Yes.
There we go.
You're a little low. Speak up.
Fantastic pronunciation.
Okay, well, my wife speaks French fluently, but I speak Pepe Le Pew French.
That's all you need for this screen name.
Okay, good. Well, you have you often tweet about what you're drinking or wearing modestly. When you listen to the Presbycast, we don't necessarily need those details because we know that the internet is sort of a dangerous place for young women. But tell us as much as you want about yourself and what's on your mind.
Sure. My husband and I have been PCA folk since 2011, so it hasn't been very long. We really enjoyed the denomination. My husband came from a non-denominational, covert Baptist background. And I came from a Catholic background, and we landed in the PCA. But I think that we've been attending some pretty unconventional and unusual PCA congregations and are living to tell about it.
Well, it's easier said than done, but congratulations on that so far. This would be a good time. I don't know if you heard this. One of our listeners pointed it out, but we'll just go ahead and do this little short special feature because this was on the latest Mortification Spin. Tell us what you think about this.
Okay, well, now that everybody is up to date on our personal lives, Carl, are we going to talk about anything that is substantive today?
No, we're going to talk about the PCA.
Oh, nice.
Only had you set me up for that one.
Oh boy, wasn't that unfortunate? What
the
what Carl
irony!
said
It
there.
is so thick. The irony is so thick. You can't even. You have to filter it just to get the liquid out.
Yeah. Well,
Just
so,
kind of triggered by that. Yeah.
well, that happened. So, what observations do you have on the current cauldron of 2020 as a young PCA member?
Yeah, I guess something that has been hard is we now have been through 2 election cycles in the PCA and found that in 2 congregations in our presbytery, things were pretty reactive. And that's been a little hard. We've really been growing and understanding the Reformed tradition and really appreciating it and feeling like our congregations were kind of walking away from that. And
Well,
that's
what do you mean when you say that? You mean that there are political stresses in the congregations?
yes, and I think in order to, something that came up in one of your former shows was this idea of the kind of the intellectual curiosity of the tradition that's in the DNA, which we really value. But we live in a university town, and I think that the association with the university and intellectualism really created more of an environment of being engaged in the world and the culture in such a way that we don't ever want to look like those crazy fundamentalists, right? We don't ever want to stand up for anything that would make us be embarrassing. And I think that affected our ecclesiology a little bit, and I think that it affected the culture of our church. And what was hard for us to watch go down was the encouragement to kind of set aside the Reformed tradition. And that became explicit at our time in one particular church here in our area, when our church partnered with another parachurch ministry in the state that is focused on racial reconciliation. And they invited these folks in to do some small group leader training. And my husband was a small group leader at the time. And the focus was really on, you really need to stop reading Reformed theologians and not focus so much on that. Stop reading white theologians and really start reading Black theologians. And at one point from the pulpit, our pastor at the time was getting his PhD in the civil rights movement and focusing on the life of Martin Luther King Jr. From the pulpit, he recommended a book some of you might be familiar with called Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. And he held it up and very loudly said, "There is power in this book." And it's effectively a liberation theology. So that's kind of what we witnessed and was disappointing.
Well, I've heard a few stories like that, and it is disconcerting, even though the impulse is maybe laudable. But I think if Miles Smith joins us tonight, he'll address some of those things too.
Yeah,
the question of wisdom.
His article in the American Conservative I thought was great, because the point that there's some language that's not clear that can appear to be woke, but we need to not be reactive to and be very cautious about is true. I posted something on Twitter today. It was a quote from Os Guinness. just about modern insights into cultural issues, and how he kind of breaks it down into 3 levels. That there is the description of the problem, and then you move into the explanation of the problem, and then you move into the solution. And modern insights are most useful to the Christian at the level of description. But once we move into explanation, we really run into problems. But if we're not careful there, we end up in solution land. And I think that that's what we were seeing in our congregation was, we can observe something like a disproportionate disparity, right? Maybe it's income disproportionately affects minority populations. But if the explanation is just Marxism or racism, then the solution is going to be problematic for the Christian. And that's what I think that we saw playing out.
Yeah. Or if it's just pragmatic, or outcomes based. All right. Well, we've been flooded with people, and I hope you'll hang on with us. I'm going to bring another guest or two in, but we do thank you for. I would encourage everyone to follow you, Petite Charette, and you're a good follow. And but hang around with us if you can. So we have a guest who's been a long time listener, and he's never been able to make it on. So I feel the responsibility to try to bring in our old friend Phil Pockrass, token RPCNA person. Are you there, Phil?
I am here.
Well, we've had some RPCNA guys on before, but here you are. Haven't had one for a long time, and you often watch these live shows and comment, and then you have to go to bed. So I don't want to keep you up late. Tell us, are you in Ohio? Is that where you are?
That's right. West Central Ohio, about an hour. Well, the pro of where we live is that we're only about an hour away from Columbus. The con is that we're only about an hour away from Columbus to our southeast. We're halfway between Cincinnati and Toledo, for those who know their Ohio geography.
So basically Kentucky. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's about 100 miles down there.
Okay, well, you could get there.
We tell briar jokes here.
So what's going on in the RPCNA, one of our sister NAPARC denominations? Besides singing psalms, what are you doing?
Well, we had to put off our synod till next year, so I don't know generally what's going on. We're having some interesting times in our presbytery. Actually, I'm serving on the current ad interim commission of our presbytery, and we have kind of a heavy situation to be dealing with here. But yeah, in the next few weeks, we'll be having an entire presbytery meeting to deal with the matter. So I can't go into it right now because it's not out in the general public, but it's taking up time. I have another video meeting with the rest of the commission tomorrow evening. Let's see, anything else of interest? I don't know. We're not having problems with revoice sorts of things. I think many people know that we've had a couple of really good position papers that have come out of our presbytery, actually, on same-sex attraction and transsexualism. And those have been adopted by Synod. So we have a good, solid base there. Of course, in our presbytery are Kent Butterfield and his wife, Rosaria. And many know of Rosaria's work. And so that's some of the stuff going on there. What else can in case anyone's asking, I do not, and I have to stand up for this, I'm not following after the jeans meme. There is no holster here, so.
You refer to our NAPARC in jeans.
NAPARC
so
jeans, that's right.
You obviously have a shoulder holster.
Yeah, I was going to say, all this means is that you're not open carrying.
Well, okay, but in the meme, it's right there on the hip. So I just mentioned that my pistol is upstairs. So that's for our armed conventicles.
Yeah, armed conventicles. Odd Deacon, who's with us, but he's in jail right now. He's in StreamYard jail.
Dang, you got my hopes up.
He loves conventicles. So,
Well, I just saw his brother a couple of weeks ago at a Presbyterian meeting. His brother serves on session of our Bloomington, Indiana congregation.
well, I don't know that I've met that brother, but I'll bet he's less odd than his than odd deacon. That's my guess.
Wouldn't know.
All right. Well, we have a number of people to get to. Phil, it's a thrill to finally see you and
Good to
have
see
you
you.
on with us. And but we'll get back to you if we have time later. Let's see. It's going to be impossible to get everyone through before our guest, and we'll have to kick a few off to make room for him at some point. But let's go to let's go. We sort of prearranged this. Our buddy confessional presby, old school presby. Sorry, we'll see how he identifies. Are you there, brother?
I am here. How are you folks?
Just fine. And one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you, you've done some time in the past.
Because he's
in
the
this-
only other biggest wrestling fan on the
Well,
show. So
let's,
you've now
let's-
heard
let's
Fun
not
with
bring-
Baptist. We're now going to talk All Elite Wrestling and everything else going on in the wrestling world right now for the next 2 hours.
Let's not bring profanity into this. So what you've done some time in the CRC. You in the PCA now? Is that right?
I'm a member of a PCA now. Correct.
Yeah, Upper Midwest.
Yeah.
But you had some thoughts on the news from, well, I guess it's from Grand Rapids. Is that where that? Yeah, Grand Rapids.
Yep.
A CRC church, CRC, Christian Reformed, formerly of NAPARC, booted from NAPARC some years ago because they began ordaining.
Formerly Christian and formerly Reformed. Ba-dum-bum.
Yeah. They began ordaining female elders, and that was what got them booted. But now an individual congregation has ordained a lesbian, same-sex relationship female deacon. So, against the advice, it should be said, of their local classis, I guess, or synod. But knowing what you know about the CRC, what do you think about this development?
Well, I think unfortunately it's not, I guess, too surprising. That particular church is probably one of the most progressive churches in the CRC, in at least in that area, and that classis that it's in, which is analogous to a presbytery, is probably one of the most liberal of the classes in the CRC. So it's not entirely surprising. I've been told there's no such thing as slippery slopes, but certainly the denomination has been heading that direction in a while, and this is, I think, just an example of one of those churches continuing to press the envelope. Even though, as you said, the official position from the CRC is that it still forbids and condemns, homosexual behavior and things of that nature. But this is certainly them getting ahead of where the CRC is on the issue. And I think frankly, probably the thing that's going to happen now that will be an issue of contention is whether the denomination will do anything about it, or whether their classes will do anything about it, or whether it'll sort of turn into what I kind of call like a sanctuary city sort of situation where these individual churches do what they're going to do, and then it eventually becomes the norm.
So do you think it's sort of the desire for cultural engagement gone mad, gone to seed? Is that what this is?
I think this is probably the worst. Well, this is probably transformationalism on steroids. And you can sort of see this probably coming down the pike 15, 20 years ago. Sort of the same arguments and the same hermeneutics that were applied to women in office and other issues are basically our play here. It's really interesting if you read the article, and then there's also a letter that the church sent to the congregation where they basically say, Well, we can't really stop. We can't really stop the train, and we're just going to keep reforming, always reforming. That phrase is showing up. Um, Not necessarily reforming according to scripture, but always reforming. And so we're just going to kind of go with um, people's desires.
Yeah, and I think you're one of those people that would say, well, I guess the big debate is whether the CRC situation, let's say in the 90s, is in any way, or the 2000s, is analogous to the PCA at the moment. Some people say no. Some people say yes. Some people say, well, at least there's an echo, or it reminds me. What's your take on that?
Well, I think if you go to the CRC website and you Google women in office and you look at the history, because they lay out the entire history for you of how that issue unfolded in the denomination, throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. Not every situation is completely analogous, but I think there's a lot of similarities between, what happened in the CRC and some of the same arguments that are that I see, percolating in the PCA. First they started with deacons, opening the office of deacon to women, and kind of slowly, incrementally, kind of continued to push the envelope, until they finally made the decision in the mid 90s, to go ahead and go with it. And actually, one of the interesting things is that they made the decision in 95 to do that. The year before, they actually decided the other way. And then, there was such an outcry, probably a lot of upset, elders' wives or something. And, they completely flipped. So, I think there's a lot of similarities that I could see between what happened in the CRC and then, what is happening potentially in the PCA.
Yeah, they're not 100% overlap. Well, we want you to hang with us, and our guest may even have some questions for you. He did not touch on the relationship or the similarities between the CRC and the PCA's situation in his recent American Conservative article. But let's welcome, if he's connected, Miles Smith IV. He of Hillsdale and
By
on the internet.
God, that's
Are you there,
Miles Smith's music.
Can you guys hear
Well,
me?
he's with us, but he's not with us. We'll give him a
Yeah, I heard it.
chance to connect. Are you with us, Miles?
I think so. I hope so. Can you guys hear me?
Okay. If you can hear us, Miles, we've
I
got
can-
no,
I can hear you.
audio. You may want to call the phone number I gave you.
Okay.
In the meantime, we'll try you again in a moment.
I could hear him.
Take him out and try that again. Let's quickly say hello to young Dale. Are you with us, Dale?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Oh,
sir.
you know what? I had that channel muted. Let me go back to Miles. It was not at all Miles' fault. I was trying to reduce noise. This is live internet radio. Miles, we got you now. Are you there?
All right. Good deal. Hey, can you hear me, Chortles?
Yes, you had done nothing wrong. It was
Oh.
me.
That's good. Well, good to talk to you guys again. So, fire away, I suppose, with whatever questions you may have about the background of how this came about, or just anything you want to know that I can say in good taste or professional taste. So.
Oh, you're going to limit yourself to that.
Well, it was nice having you, Miles.
Yeah,
We'll see you again next time.
Nice being on. So,
There's a special message for you here, Miles.
Don't be an Erdman.
Okay, so just
Okay.
keep that in mind. Don't do that. So,
well,
you wrote it. So, I mean, let's and you gave credit. Let's give credit where credit's due. Eric Erickson wrote something about the PCA for a secular publication, and lo and behold, you were asked to do the same thing. So, Eric's
Yeah.
article sort of shook it loose, and you picked it up. So
Yeah.
and writers don't write headlines, but the piece is provocatively titled "Will the PCA Go Woke?" And the subhead: the denomination's good faith efforts to address historic racism are falling into wokeness and critical race theory, but there's still a way forward. So tell us what prompted you to write the piece.
Yeah, so two things. One, I didn't write the byline or the title, and I was also asked to do it, so I didn't volunteer myself. I was asked if I could speak with some sense of competence to what's going on in the PCA now, and I thought I could. I wanted to be charitable. You guys know I'm not a member of a PCA church, but I consider it my ecclesiastic hometown, and definitely wish it a goodwill, and I want it to be healthy and unified as much as possible. So I wrote it. I guess more than anything, I'm surprised. I didn't think it was particularly controversial. I think my answer to if the PCA was going woke was fairly, I hope, charitable, and that I didn't think it necessarily was. That just that folks need to be careful, especially when it comes to my big hook there at the end is really just to be careful about rhetorical concessions. Language has meaning, and language is perhaps as important as doctrine in some ways. How we say something can be as important as what we say. I teach at a college where we drive into our students constantly the power of language and the power of ideas. And so I think my 18-year-old freshmen really get that. And so my hope is just that there's recognition among officers of all stripes and dispositions that our language that we use means something, and that we should be really cautious when we concede certain rhetorical points, certain rhetorical formulations about things as varied as race, things as varied about the nature of the offices, who can fill an office, et cetera, et cetera. So I really didn't set out to be at all controversial. I didn't set out to indict anybody. And so I think I'm surprised that people, I think I saw some folks, I think, took this as maybe sort of a slap on the wrist. That wasn't it at all. And in fact, I think I came away probably a bit friendlier than Eric Erickson might have. I don't know Eric Erickson, but he's obviously a capable guy in what he does. So I was more surprised than anything else about just how what the reaction to it was.
Well, I
Well,
think you sort of hit the nail on the head too with about how language matters, and that's something I know we've talked about on this show around previous General Assemblies or things like that. Is that the language of the overtures is such that no one outside of the PCA is going to understand the distinctions that are being made. Like I think like the idea of commissioned church worker versus a deacon or things like that is to the outside it's here's a female on the website listed alongside a male, so functionally there will be no difference, and so to be able to, I think that's what kind of always strikes me is how immediately defensive some of the progressive side is when you just sort of say like, well, hey, what are we actually conceding here? Even if you're doing it with the best of intentions.
Well, and Revoice was mostly about language. Most of the people's problems with Revoice related things had to do with terminology. So that you didn't even touch on Revoice, but there's another example of the importance of words and terms, and especially loaded terms from the culture.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the language that gets used is, I want to be as charitable as possible. I don't think anybody sets out to be malicious or to even be heterodox or anything like that. I think what happens is that we end up sort of seeing a problem, or what we perceive to be a problem in our society, and then instead of sort of using, if you're a Presbyterian, it would be the Westminster Confession. If you're a Lutheran, it would be the Book of Concord. Instead of using those documents and sort of saying, okay, what does this actually say? What do these words actually mean? We want to kind of have almost a conversation with confessional standards. Now, if you disagree with a certain aspect of a confessional standard, you should sort of be honest about your disagreement. I'm not a Lutheran. I'm not a Presbyterian because I disagree with maybe certain things that are in the Book of Concord, in the Augsburg Confession, or in Westminster, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is, though, is when you sort of start reshaping the articulation of what's actually in a confessional document to address a sort of a social problem of your day, because really what happens is you really end up driving your church with the disposition of the day, rather than some sort of transcendent appeal to, if you're a serious Protestant, to word and sacrament. So the church becomes really something that's sort of driving at a particular issue, rather than driving at transcendent ministry of the word or the sacraments themselves. So I think that's probably the biggest concern, is that what church is, it becomes something very different. And a church is hopefully a place where everyone can come and feel welcome. You want people of all races to feel welcome at a church. But I think the question of what church is doing seems to be a big part of the debate. Is the church meant to engage social moments? Well, if so, how do you keep a sort of transcendent confessional standard? Obviously, confessions can be amended, but they're not meant to do that very often. So that seems to be the question. And I did not get a lot of pushback from moderates or conservatives or moderates in the PCA. The guys I know who contacted me said, "Hey, thanks. This is probably something we should be thinking about." And so I'm not sure what folks are upset about, other than I'm a historically oriented Protestant who sees things a certain way, and they don't see it that way.
Well, I think the most important difference between wings of the PCA, if you will, has to do with the conception of the church and what it can rightfully do, and that's what we're talking about here. It's issues of social and cultural and even political engagement that are at issue. I mean, when you talk about those things, you're talking about the very nature and mission of the church. We'll hear guys talk about philosophy of ministry as if you can have any of a range of them. But I think those that we refer to as ordinary means of grace guys, whether they're high church or low church, I think they would say, would prefer that the range of options for the activity of the church be somewhat limited and circumscribed, and that by the confession and catechisms. I think that's your point, more or less.
Absolutely. And I think, I put in the beginning of the article, I didn't really want to touch on this because I really wanted to keep the piece from being about politics. I don't enjoy partisan politics very much. But your caller earlier mentioned going through 2 election cycles in the PCA. One thing, I don't think that's just a PCA problem. I think it's a quote unquote evangelical problem. And if you follow me on Twitter, you can figure out what I actually think of that term as a taxonomical, how useful it is to describe any group of Christians, but it's a quote unquote evangelical problem. I'm not sure that evangelicalism has ever been anything outside of a socio-political identity. And so for a lot of these folks, that's all they have. And to sort of have their church do what their church is supposed to do, you have to have some sort of socio-political space in the culture at large. And if the culture at large doesn't really value what you believe sociopolitically, well, you're out. And for them, that would mean, well, their existence as a religious person is out. And so I think that's another thing that's going on, kind of this desperate need to not just engage with the culture, but to be able to quote unquote speak to the culture. I think that's a real desperate need among quote unquote evangelicals. And the problems with that is that, one, it presumes a Unitarian national culture. I teach at a college that only has about 1,400 students, but my students come from everywhere. We have a national draw. And one of the first things I ask them, most of them are religious, most of them are Christians, not all of them, but most of them. So I'll ask them, what do you think makes you an American? What's part of your culture? And inevitably, you actually get remarkably different answers. And so there is no national culture to speak to, sort of like the idea there's natural conversations. I just hate the even notion of quote unquote national conversations. And the same thing goes for the idea that there's an American church. You'll see this rhetorical device used a lot. People say the American church has failed at something. And you see this especially with regard to race. Now, I'm a Protestant, so I think the church can fail. I don't think we're perfect. But having said that, the idea that there's a Unitarian national church, that some sort of socio-cultural national church isn't real. And it's a rhetorical device, really, I think, aimed at a certain type of deconstruction. Now, whether it's malicious or not, I don't necessarily think it is. But I want to give an example. I live in Michigan, and I'm not from the Midwest. I'm from North Carolina. But when I lived up here, I lived with a guy who was, he's happily married now, but when we were young faculty, we shared a house, and he was a Wisconsin Synod Lutheran. The Wisconsin Synod has never really had any relationship with slavery. It's been abolitionist since they arrived in the 1840s. So to say that the American church has failed is to obliterate the existence of a group like the Wisconsin Synod. It's to obliterate the existence of churches that actively fought against Jim Crow or slavery. So all this language is really sort of driving at a narrative that's really contrived. I think that's what I want to sort of, if there's one thing you can get out of my piece, it's just, let's be really careful that we don't use really sort of contrived language to create a story that's not there, to create a reality that's not there.
Well, in the second paragraph of your piece, which we have on the screen, it's an ironic statement, and it's arguable, but you say that the PCA identifies with identifies or relates to or fits with, quote, largely non-creedal and non-confessional evangelicalism. Is there some cognitive dissonance going on there? I mean, does it make sense? Or if you're culturally oriented, I mean, that pretty much equals evangelicalism, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's the nature of evangelicalism, as a construction, as a socio-intellectual construction. One of the things I always think is interesting is, the Westminster Confession is the official standard of the PCA. I think all the Westminster standards except the directory are constitutional for the PCA. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
Okay. So obviously there's things in the larger and shorter catechism. I still am a person who feels devotion to especially the shorter catechism, but there's things in there that if I were to drop in to especially sort of a large kind of more evangelically oriented PCA church, it would be really confused why I was saying this. And so I think it is arguable. I think there are confessional Presbyterian churches. My friend, in real life friend Ben Glazer is listening right now, and we have lunch in Charlotte every once in a while, and so I view his church as an ARP church. It's a beautiful little church. If you're ever in rural South Carolina, you should visit him. But he's a confessional guy. He's in the IRP. I know PCA ruling elders who are wedded to the confession. And so I think it just really comes down to what you think, again, sort of Charles, what you said earlier, what church is doing. If you really are sold on the confession, it would make sense if you're a Presbyterian to be sold on the confession. That's what you sort of make church about. Church is about what's going on in those documents. It's about word and sacrament. It really comes down to what you think church is doing. And I'm pretty Augustinian, and I don't think church is going to have as many answers maybe as we would like, no matter how well-intentioned we are.
All right. So a lot of these, the racial reconciliation stuff in the PCA, it really started in 2010 with a strategic plan, but it started at a General Assembly level in 2014, 2015. So that's pre-Trump. But the Trump factor has prompted a lot more political angst in the churches because of the 81%, et cetera. As those who believe in the spirituality of the church, we do believe that the church shouldn't be necessarily making political pronouncements, but you refer to Tim Keller's statement on abortion, and while we agree with it, from one standpoint, I think your point is you can be incautious in the way you weigh in on these political things.
Yeah, I think there is a real sense. My church is conspicuously apolitical for the most part, and I live in a conservative town, in a conservative part of Michigan. So most of the people I know are relatively conservative people. I work for a conservative college. One of the things I think that Trump has done is sort of, I think, open up a larger intellectual discussion. I'm a historian of American intellectual thought and religion. So I think he's actually opening up kind of this older question of what is politics meant to do too. Is politics about sort of immanentizing the eschaton, or is it about keeping order? I think those are two questions that American Presbyterians and a lot of American Calvinists have really fought over. This is not a battle that's unique to American Calvinism, but it's been pretty intense. I study the first half of the 19th century broadly, and you really see in the Presbyterian Church this being argued over. So it's not new. I think it's come back up in a way that surprises, especially this generation of Presbyterian, because there's a lot of Presbyterians. There's a lot of assumptions that have been made for the last 40 years, and now people are having to sort of ask themselves, "Oh, is that true or not? Are certain things really the case about what it is to be a conservative and a Christian, or a liberal and a Christian, et cetera, et cetera? What is it? What is the place of government, and what is the place of a Christian's engagement with government in a polity where we all supposedly have and I'm using air quotes here, voice?" So I think that's a question that Presbyterians are confronting too. What is the nature of government? What is the nature of the civil order?
Yeah, and you talked about people being shocked. It seems like a lot of people never thought about politics or some of these issues until a couple of years ago. And I don't know about you, but I think growing up in the South, we've always thought about these things. You couldn't get away from them.
Yeah, and the South has always been, in some ways, more political. I also think Chortles, you mentioned that. I think you and I are both native to the South, and I don't know if all the listeners are, but one thing I think is kind of interesting is that there's presumptions about our relationship to this idea of the nation. When people use this idea of the nation, there's a certain sort of voyeurism that goes on with people looking at the South. I grew up in the middle of North Carolina. You live over in East Tennessee, and so they're different places, but they do have one thing in common: is that they were both part of the old Confederacy. And so any sort of place that has a history of slavery sort of becomes a mirror in which there's a national idea that can be reflected off of it. And one of the things you see about the South is that, well, you can, no matter how bad your moment is, you can always be glad you're not the Southerners. And what's happened now is we have the added sort of aspect of race in conversations about religion. I think it's really interesting how the paradigm that you and I would recognize about the South and its relationship to race has been really nationalized. I think it's funny. There's almost like we hate the South so much we want to imprint its failures on the rest of the United States, because that way you can sort of create a narrative by which there's more quote unquote urgency. Well, it's not just in the South, it's everywhere. And evangelicals are good social revolutionists. I think it's in their DNA. And if you can build a problem that big and say, well, it's not just a place like Tennessee, it's not just South Carolina, it's not just Louisiana, it's everywhere, then you can sort of have a reason to exist again if you're an evangelical, and sociopolitics is sort of all what you're about. So it's a way of sustaining a socio-political identity that really has no connection to theology or doctrine as such.
Yeah, and it's also a way for a younger generation to feel superior to or disown or think they've upgraded from their from their parents. I mean, that happens in every generation. I think that's a factor as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm on the second part of your article, but in the third, you talk about how Tim Keller sort of he sort of criticized his own tribe more than liberal Protestantism when he spoke at Princeton. Yeah, there it is. And we have a tendency to think, to think our tribe is worse than everyone else, and that's usually not true.
No, one of the things I think is interesting is that when you look at the idea of evangelicals, one of the things I think is really interesting is that the whole identity is attached to this idea that there was a fundamentalist split from the main line. The fundamentalists became, once they got educated and nice, they became evangelicals. That's kind of the taxonomy. Daryl was on here last week, and so he can distinguish this better than I can. But that's kind of the broad story. One thing I think is interesting is that I'd like to propose that one of the biggest problems with evangelicalism as a construction is that it's based largely on the raw numbers of the Southern Baptist Church. The Southern Baptist Church is a mainline denomination. Now, it may be a conservative one. It may have a lot of people with evangelical and fundamentalist proclivities, but it's a mainline church. Its history is a part of the broad mainline. And so the whole taxonomy of evangelical becomes problematic when we push it too hard, because it basically becomes, we're going to pick a group of people who we don't like. It's largely exclusionary. That's why it's there. If you're an evangelical, you want to exclude fundamentalist. And that's why that term evangelical exists. So you can be something other than a fundamentalist. And so I think
Well, Sean Lucas, who you quote, he also says that the PCA is a mainline denomination.
Yeah, I think I don't know.
Or aspires to be, at least.
Yeah, and maybe it is aspirational. I'll just mention two things. Mainline denominations have a sociology to them that the PCA doesn't. And what I mean by that is you can't name any prominent Rockefellers or Morgans or anybody like that in the PCA. It's not really in the makeup. The PCA is a product of Mississippi and Alabama. And so the mainline energies, intellectual energies, tend to be on the East Coast. The PCA's headquarters, the PCUS was is headquartered in Louisville now. So I think there's just kind of some different sociology going on. Perhaps the PCA is aspirationally mainline. It would just be aspirational, though. It would be hard to kind of find a quote unquote theological or sociological way in which it's quote unquote mainline. But I've only read parts of Dr. Lucas's book, so I should read probably read the whole thing. So he may have a good case.
Let's talk about the reason that your article was controversial to the extent that it was, and that's that it was about what we call wokeness, and maybe not the fact of the PCA's wokeness, but what you see is maybe a tendency in that direction. So let's talk about that word. Can you define it, and what do you see in the PCA that makes you think they could be described as falling victim or under the sway of wokeness?
I think, as best I can figure it, wokeness is a certain set of rhetorical commitments regarding how the socio-civil order relates to the history of racism. And those rhetorical commitments tend to be, not entirely, but I think it's pretty obviously tend to be deconstructionists regarding a lot of hallmarks of what maintains civil society. The Black Lives Matter group, I think they've since taken this off their page, but there was a lot of sort of attacks on the family. And now I know it's not popular to praise the family too much nowadays, lest you be accused of being a fundamentalist or something like that. But there were just simply presumptions made about the broad failure of society to address racism. And so you have to really overthrow society as it is and recreate a new one. And so I think wokeness is revolutionary. At its baseline, it's revolutionary.
Yeah. And if we listen to some of those who are at the tip of the spear, and I'm thinking back to 2017 with the Truths Table podcast, three ladies, they pretty much said that white supremacy was baked into the Westminster standards and had to be they had to be interrogated and they had to be excised of that. So that's what you're talking about when you're talking about deconstruction.
Yeah,
So,
I think one thing I just think this is worth noting, Charles, is that, how race itself, the way we talk about it, is a really modern construction. I heard a sermon recently by a guy I really respect, a Westminster Cal grad, who said he was talking about the story about the Samaritan woman. And he said he mentioned that these were racial, that the Jews and Samaritans, there were racial differences. Well, that's actually not true. What made the Jews and Samaritans different was liturgical differences. It was where they worshiped. That's what distinguished Jews and Samaritans. Jews said, you worship on that mountain, we worship on this mountain. So a better analog would be the difference between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. than race. And yet the sort of modern mind is that we jump and say that's a racial difference. It's not a racial difference. It's a liturgical one. And yet our modern minds are sort of keyed in to see the modern paradigm of race in that. And so I think the problem is, again, we're making up stuff where it doesn't exist. And something is like the story of Christ and the woman at the well.
Yeah, and if you listen very carefully to a lot of the racial reconciliation stuff, their goal is always to change worship as well. They believe that a lot of people believe that the regulative principle itself, or what they would call white Western European worship, has to go, and that there are other forms of worship that are more universal, or at least we should have sort of a buffet approach.
Yeah,
so there is a liturgical element, no doubt.
And that's again, that's not just in the PCA. In my own communion, there's the sort of confessional version of an Anglican would be someone who sticks to the articles and sticks to the formularies. The formularies are a little bit like the directory of worship, and so there is a move to even change those because. And the question, the term that gets used a lot is accessibility. That worship isn't accessible, and I'm not exactly sure what that means, especially when something as simple as language, it really cooks people into worship. I think that's one of the remarkable things about singing psalms. You get to know those psalms. In my tradition, it's saying the rites, saying the confession of faith. And so language and this idea of accessibility are now, you're right, there's a desire for negotiation there. And what's interesting is that desire is relatively new, because you don't see it even in other eras of massive social change. The Civil War, the American Revolution, the Civil Rights era, even in a lot of churches, you don't see it quite as much as you do now. And so what triggers that, I don't know. Again, historians of religion in the 20th century can certainly speak to this more than I can.
All right. So, well, of course, we could say in the late 19th century and early 20th that with the changing of many Presbyterian hymns, Machen writes about that. Machen. Hallelujah right there. I meant to hit the Machen horn. Sorry. Machen,
a lot of people don't know that's the only audio recording we have of the man.
That's right. Him leaning on the horn. Yeah. But there were, when the Battle Hymn of the Republic began to be sung in a church, I mean, that was a liturgical concession.
Absolutely.
To a social impetus or desire for change.
And if I could I want to make a shameless plug. My colleague, Richard Gamble, has recently written just an absolutely fantastic book on the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Richard is an OPC ruling elder, and Cornell published his book. It's called A Fiery Gospel. It is excellent, and I commend it to anybody who wants to learn about the hymn sort of introduction into churches broadly.
Yeah, Machen was not a fan, and we should probably have Gamble on the show. So you put in a word for us. We'll get Daryl to do that too. So that'll help. But we it's just been implied. But you are worshiping with Anglicans at the moment.
I do. Yeah, I work at I'm very fortunate. I have a very serious church that takes worship very seriously. That's not always the case in the Anglican Church. There's the difference between progressivism, I'm going to use that word loosely, progressivism in the PCA and in ACNA is progressivism tends to be more low energy in ACNA, just because we're probably a more low energy group to begin with. But I'm very lucky. One of our pastors is a conservative Gordon Conwell guy. Another guy is a Westminster Cal grad. So we're very lucky. We have a very healthy church, and so I can't say enough good things about our rector and his commitment to sticking with the articles and the formularies. We run church like you would have seen a Church of England parish in 1830, with the difference of we sing more hymns. The broad hymn singing in the Church of England didn't begin until the 1820s and 30s. It was mainly Psalms before that. So,
Well, I'm fascinated that you Anglicans have luck while we Presbyterians have providence.
Yeah. There's a lot of jokes I could throw out about that, but I won't bore your listeners. So,
All right. Well, again, we're back to the article. One of the things that got you in trouble was you brought up the names of real people. But if you hadn't brought up the names of real people, you would have been criticized for that too. So you did name a few people in the PCA who use language or concepts that you are you think is unwise. So we'll just say that, and I'll tell you that's one of the reasons that you made some people unhappy. I'm quite sure, and we've got some of those on the screen there now. We don't have to go into it. But back to the language, and I think most people miss this about your article. It was a lot about language and words and expressions, even in worship. And you mentioned that there's a PCA church or network of churches in the D.C. area, and by their own admission, they used a creed in worship, quote, written in Honduras in 1980. This is during the Contra War, Nicaragua, all that stuff, as a part of something called, quote, the Mass of the Marginalized People. And you criticized them for being, quote, remarkably incurious about who was confecting the quasi-Catholic liturgies in Honduras around that time. You referred to liberation theologians.
I work at a college where I have really the pleasure. I'm not Roman Catholic, but I have a lot of Roman Catholic colleagues and a lot of Roman Catholic students. And one of the things that if you talk to some of the very serious Catholics, I do is that there is a real sense that some of the major problems in the modern Catholic Church center around their own liturgical innovations that are birthed in Latin America in the middle of the 20th century. And so I don't really want to indict anybody in particular. I think it's just a call to be cautious. Words have meanings. And especially when you think about something like confessing sin. Words have meanings, and that confession has a meaning.
As a fellow Southerner, I think it's considered bad manners to confess other people's grandparents' sin.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I probably come at this almost from the left of folks in the PCA. I'm a historian of the South, and I'm a relatively conservative person, but I'm also really willing to admit that slavery was a gross historic injustice. So much so that I'm not sure. You think about we use this word survivors. Think about if you are someone who's survived serious racial injustice. Is there anything me apologizing for, and I didn't have anything to do with it, that actually is going to mean anything to you? It's really too bad for it's too bad for me to be able to apologize for. If it's that serious an injustice, it's something that's so serious that I can't apologize for it in my capacity as someone who wasn't a part of it. And so if it is that brutally dehumanizing, and I think it probably was most of the time, it is not something that I could ever apologize for meaningfully or effectively. And so I think this is me being probably too Augustinian, but it's just too bad. You're not going to be able to make it better by an apology that really is on some level contrived.
Well, you talk about rhetorically vague and socio-intellectually contrived strategies and words. And I think that's sort of what you're talking about here. We hear that, some people would say, well, we base this on, Deuteronomy or the prophets, but it's amazing how closely it aligns with what we hear on MSNBC or Democracy Now, or what a lot of us, even when you're as old as I am, we heard these things in college classrooms. It sounds a lot like Howard Zinn, some of it. So I think one of the things you contend is that we tend to fall. We tend to probably buy high and sell low on some of these cultural and sociological strategies.
Absolutely. We just presume too much about ourselves. One of my there's a fantastic movie. I have this saying with my students. I call it the Remains of the Day test. It's a novel written by Kazuo Ishiguro and made into a film with Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson. It's a beautiful film. If you've never watched it, go do it. But there's a character in there whose name is Lord Darlington. And Lord Darlington is a kind man. He's a gentleman. He has the status that comes with being a British nobleman. And so he really wants to do good. And so it's set in the 1930s. And so what he says is, I get that these Nazis aren't great people, but, we're British noblemen. We have everybody's best interest in mind. We can figure it out. So the story is he invites them to his home. He has the British Prime Minister over, and he has representatives of the Nazi Germany over. In the film, his nephew is a reporter. And his nephew is snooping around the house, but they won't let him into any of the meetings. And so he asks the butler, who's played by Anthony Hopkins, is my uncle meeting with the Nazi ambassador and the prime minister? And the butler, who's totally in the dark, says, I think they may be in there. I don't know. And the nephew says something really interesting. He says, do you think my uncle is a good man? And the butler says, yes, I think he's a great guy. Why would you doubt that? And the nephew says, well, because he's meeting with the Nazis. He thinks he can control them. And the butler says, well, I have every reason to believe that Lord Darlington will do what's right. And the nephew says, and that's what makes it so bad. That's what makes it so horrible. He thinks that he can do right. He's actually trying to be noble, and he's getting used. And I think that's what's so compelling, is that we have this presumption that we can actually do certain things that we can't. We assume far too much about our ability to affect social change for good. We've kind of deluded ourselves. And that doesn't mean that everybody who's trying to engage socially is doing it with sort of bad or inconsistent motives. In fact, it's probably their good motives that make it so problematic.
Yeah, I think it is naive. You use the word naivete several times. And maybe it's generational. Maybe it's what 25 and 30 and 40-year-old people do. Maybe all young people aren't as old souls as you are, Miles. Maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, well, you become a really old soul really fast living in small town Michigan, and so
You're wearing sweaters and slippers.
you do, you start wearing sweater vests and scarves and whatnot, and not the cool hipster scarves like the big fat lumberyard scarves. So
the Paul Tripp scarves.
yeah, I don't have any of those. Yeah, I've just got plaid ones that my grandmother gave me when my grandfather passed away. So
if you have a mustache that big, you don't need a scarf. It would seem to me.
yeah. Facial hair is it's the new thing in my department. I know one of my colleagues is just now growing a mustache, and so haven't checked in on everybody, but we don't have the elegance of your beard and mustache turtles, but we'd like to get there.
Well, we should we'll move along. We only meant to keep you 30 minutes, but one of the things you I guess I'm going to criticize you for for your critics since they're not here. You sort of end the article by saying, well, there is a way to do this. It's not the Benedict option. It's the Duncan option. So here's Miles, young white guy. He says the model should be this older white guy, Ligon Duncan. So, people are not going to like that because one of the things that the anti-racist movement, and you looked into this, there are a lot of churches out there that their program now is anti-racism. And there's the idea that if you're not anti-racist, you probably are racist. But to be anti-racist means that you defer at most points to the minority voices. But here you are pointing out, holding up as a good example, old white guy, Ligon Duncan. Was that a mistake? And if not, why did you employ him as your positive example?
I think he's a pastor and an intellectual. He's a chancellor of RTS.
He's no longer at First Pres Jackson.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. He's
Right.
I think he's fully at RTS now. He's a trained pastor, I should say, that way. I think, no matter what people think about Ligon Duncan, he's tried to do things in a gentlemanly way. People may not agree with every single thing he did, but I think on the whole, he's tried to be judicious, be charitable. I don't know him personally, but I think he's a good example. Even if folks may disagree with him at times, no one bats 1,000. I don't bat 1,000. No one does, and so I think he's probably trying to do the best he can. And so I just view him as a good example. I think he's kind of done things, at least tried to do things the right way. And so I think he's someone to look to. As to his race, I think that I don't know if an older denomination, or I guess a relatively old denomination like the PCA by now, is going to be able to unify around any one other than someone who's been around it for a long time. So I wasn't even thinking about his race. He's just someone who's been prominent in the denomination for a long time. I think he's trustworthy. A lot of people can look at him and say, "Hey, this is a guy we can trust." And I think that's if you want to be, if you want to actually have unity, and I think unity hopefully is the goal of all these things, you should look to a figure who's relatively unifying.
That wouldn't have been a novel concept in most decades, but it is very counter to the to wokeism, to hardcore anti-racists.
And not just that. I mean, this is the first time I think, at least for myself, and we've been doing this show for what, I don't know, 4 years now, maybe a little bit longer than that. And in a lot of ways, this is the first time that I'm seeing some of these quotes from, from Duncan or someone in quote unquote his position. And I know we don't have, popes or anything like that, but these were really, really good quotes from Duncan, pulling from other articles and stuff. Particularly like we're not living segregated lives out of a conviction that we believe in white supremacy or that we're against race mixing. It just happened because of the way we live. I thought that was an incredibly, just dare I say it, an incredibly winsome way of putting it. And that's been my experience. I have family who live in Jackson, Mississippi. I used to go every summer, and there were so many, obviously it was much different than the life I was, living in California, just culturally, but there was never, an intentionally supremacist way of going about it. You didn't know any different. And so I appreciate Duncan saying, you can see the things you didn't see before. You're finally in a situation where you can start learning, and going, along that. And hopefully, I hope that the premise of, that final quote, I hope the premise of your article is true. I hope that they don't go any further.
Yeah, I don't know what will happen. I tend to think, though, that if guys like Ligon Duncan are influencing the conversation, then the PCA can be healthy for a long time. I can't see the future, but my parents went to church with RTF profs and still do, and they seem very orthodox, very conservative in a non-reactionary way, and committed to what it is to be reformed. So I can't see the future, but I think if that's how the conversation goes, it'll be healthy. And I do know that some folks I know hit me. I think from I saw a group of guys hitting me, kind of from the right on this, and saying there was a core too who said, well, I was, you're too nice to these people. And I think some of it is you're never going to make anyone happy. And so on some level, if you're making people happy for multiple reasons, you've probably approximated something like a unifying position. So that was my admittedly, wishing well to all the people in the PCA who are trying to get these conversations going and do it in goodwill.
Yeah, well, I think you've done a good job of portraying the PCA. And again, there are some people that just don't want certain things discussed or brought up at all. And this is not from the right, but I think from the left. Any criticism, and criticism that's not seen as 100% accurate and winsome and just excessively bending over to a degree that might hurt your back. It's just not acceptable. But I think we live in a fairly fragile age. I'm not even as we discussed briefly online. I think even when we look at the presidential debate the other night, we've lived in eras where even political disagreements were much more violent and vocal. I mean, anyone can watch Prime Minister's Question Time on the BBC or C-SPAN or wherever they have it, and the debate the other night cannot hold a candle to that. So I think we're a bit fragile, and our expectations are Well, they're too close to Sunday school or daycare ethics or something.
Yeah, the fragility aspect is really, um, un, I live in a place that isn't particularly fragile, and that's because I live in a Rust Belt town, and so there's a lot of problems with Michigan, and where I live, we have social problems just like everything else. But one of the things I think is really telling is this idea of expectation. Most of the people who live in my neighborhood don't have kind of the massive expectations that a lot of Sunbelt suburban evangelicals do. And I think that's really important to pick out that difference. My neighbors are flawed people, I'm sure, but I can tell you that if I were to go tell them, hey guys, bad news, we're not going to be able to solve the problem of poverty and race in your lifetimes, they would kind of look at me weird and say, idiot, you thought you could? And so I think there's this question of expectation is something that I hope a sociologist will pick up on at some point.
Well, if they're allowed to do so, if it's not considered to be too much in bad taste. So as we end, we could even bring in the eschatological. A lot of the fantasies about fixing everything seem kind of post-millennial, and many of us are amillennial, and our expectations for this world, this side of glory, are not quite so glorious.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that the current movements actually transcend eschatology, and one thinks of kind of the difference between a figure like a Doug Wilson, who's postmillennial, and maybe a young, more progressive PCA minister who I would think would talk about being postmillennial. By the way, I think this is
not very much at all. No.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is you have this idea of eschatology that's not actually eschatological. It really is more evangelical than even some of the older Reformed ideas of postmillennialism. It's more about urgent social change than it is about an actual eschatological vision. It is here and now. Think about the quote, justice deferred is justice denied. You'll hear this quote. That's not an eschatological quote. That's a temporal one, and it's a revolutionary one. So I think that's what's actually interesting is this has rounded a unique corner. It's not properly even eschatological anymore. It's right here and right now, and it is small r revolutionary. Maybe it's well-intentioned, but most revolutions are, and it's hard to actually control them, even the good, the quote-unquote good ones.
Well, a good future show would be the revolutionary impulse. I have noted that among the woke, when they refer to departed people, they say rest in power, not rest in peace. And that sort of that signifies something. And it views the departed for their symbolic and motivating value, and seems maybe not to care whether they rest in peace. And it's a little different. Well, anything you'd like to share? What we've done. We've talked to you for a long time, and everybody's really happy that we have. But we lost all of our callers in the meantime. So I'll go ahead and say, if you were on hold, get back in, and we'll have time for a few callers before we wrap up. But we've enjoyed it, and we'll link to your article. Of course, most of our listeners have already read it. I would encourage you not to be scared off by any reaction to this piece. I think the a lot of things are written and provoke no reaction. I actually think it's good. It could be a healthy sign that that the PCA is being discussed, even if somewhat negatively or at least critically, in the wider conservative cultural press. But that's one of the things people didn't like about it. Just the fact that two conservatives, conservative publications or platforms, are discussing the PCA, and people are just convinced that it's all about politics. And I don't think you really brought politics into it at all.
No, I think it might be worth noting in a lot of in places like Washington, D.C., here on my college, here in the campus that I work at, the energy of people is not to look at the PCA and say, "Oh, it's too conservative." In a lot of places where people are very political and involved in politics, and this is I think a failure also intellectually, but nonetheless it happens, is for people to look at the PCA and say, "Oh my goodness, it's cheesy. Look at it. How could I ever be involved in high office as a conservative person and be a part of this?" And I think that's a motivation for a lot of kids to join the Roman Catholic Church. And so we have kind of a very different. Our students are, very involved in intellectual life of a conservative movement. So we have a different problem here per se. And when people confront the PCA in our world, a lot of times it's from the right, and it's questioning like, hey, how is this a serious intellectual Protestant denomination? So a little bit different set of problems, but one a set to maybe think about, especially for people out there who don't know a whole lot about the world of Washington, D.C., et cetera, et cetera. So.
Yeah, well, you got to be Roman Catholic to work for Fox News. So maybe that'll change someday. Well, thanks for joining us, Miles, and people have enjoyed it. We had many comments on the live stream, and we do appreciate it, and we'll do it again.
All right, hey, good to talk to you, Resby. Good to chat for a minute too.
Absolutely, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks, guys.
All right, Miles Smith IV. You know where to find him online. We'll bring in. She's come back in, Petite Charette, and I think she's enjoyed hearing from Miles. Petite One, your reaction.
Oh yeah, I really enjoyed that. It was great to hear him speak on the article. It was great to get a better understanding of his perspective, and I'm totally on board with the language issue. That was something that we were watching happen in our congregation. Was we were hearing words, thinking we understood what they meant, but realizing they were being used in a very different way.
Yeah. So, I mean, how many years ago was this? 3, 4?
We were members at this particular congregation officially from 2015 through 2018, but we were attending from 2011 through 2018. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and I do know that I do know the congregation, and it would be one of the more progressive, more innovative out there. So you probably had a preview of coming attractions in the mid teens that some people didn't have. A lot of people were surprised at what came upon. The PCA and the SBC and conservative evangelicalism, kind of post 2015. But it was there before that, and you may not have been as surprised as some others. Any other thoughts on what Miles had to say?
No, I really enjoyed it. I would love to hear him talk again. I wish he was in the PCA.
Well, we could get him back. We could get lucky, to quote him, and get him back. So now we had to give him had to give him a hard time over that.
That's right. I look forward to your next Fun with Baptist segment as well, which
Well,
I know
let's
is not
do.
appropriate for the.
No,
the
no, we're
call-in.
going to do that. We're going since you you stay on the line. We're going to play Fun with Baptist right now. Thanks for
Yes.
mentioning that. So, well, let's see if we can cue our announcer up, and here we go.
What a fellowship, what a joy divine, on the everlasting arms.
Welcome to Fun with Baptists on your favorite podcast, Presbycast. And now, Baptists.
I'm just continuing on with heritage here. I'm just continuing on with Bible doctrine. Listen, you want to make America great again, it ain't going to be done by a politician. It's going to be done by a pulpit, and it's not going to be done by some sissy, effeminate, weird, sissified, evangelical, glossing over nonsense behind the pulpit. It's going to be done by reproving and rebuking and exhorting with all long suffering and doctrine. I'm going to tell you today, I feel a snare on this. Are we okay? Can I preach for 5 more minutes on this? I feel pretty good this morning. Some of you ain't liking it, but I'm going to preach it anyhow. Amen. These conferences going around today trying to teach fundamental Baptists how to act like evangelicals and wiggle like evangelicals and be sissified nonsense in the pulpit. All they're doing is going to conferences and rubbing evangelical slop all over each other and coming back and stinking like an evangelical and changing the aura of a fundamental Baptist church into a softer, weaker, sissified kind of stuff. I'm going to tell you something today. What we need today is men to get up behind the pulpit and say, "Thus saith the Lord, this is how it is. God give you an ultimatum. Get right or get out." Hallelujah. And that's how it works today.
Hallelujah. Yes, amen.
All right. So where's the lie, Resby and Petite Charette? He was pretty much right about all that. Stinking like an evangelical and conferences.
I'm
and all
wondering.
that.
Why can't we have him moderate the next debate? Again, you keep playing these, and I keep having no issues with what they're saying. So,
Yeah, it's if they didn't insist on not baptizing babies, where would we be?
Well, there are a lot of people that would say we're a species of fundamentalists, but obviously the ethos is it's a little strange. The whole style is it's out there, but I thought that he's talking about, it's not about politics. It's about and he talked about the aura of independent fundamental Baptists. I never thought about them having an aura.
every time I hear someone talk about an aura, I think about the Rick James episode of Chappelle's Show. It's like, he had an aura. I seen it, and it's just.
Because you know what the 5 fingers say to the face.
Yes, I wish more people asked that question. If I may preach for 5 more minutes on this, we could probably do a whole sermon. Well, not a whole sermon, but a whole series on the way that one 22-minute sketch comedy show changed the way people talk from the day that it aired until now. I mean, it is simply the most quotable 22 minutes in all of comedy.
I agree. I think we need a sideshow on that.
All right.
Well, Resby's your guy. That's not for me. I'm not much on the old pop culture. But, anything else for us, Petite, except that you wanted Sylvia to come on. She doesn't want to come on, but she's
I can
listening.
respect that. I appreciate Sylvia. And I can respect that.
Can we all agree that she's the best account on Twitter?
100%.
Yeah. There's no doubt about that. Well, I thought that might happen. We had Miles on for so long that we ran everybody else off, and that's okay because there were some knuckleheads on there, and quite frankly, some of them I was not looking forward to hearing from, and we were able to just safely avoid that. So I think we've sort of exhausted the subject. We will hope to hear from you again. Petite Charette, we need more female voices. Not because there's a numerical formula for it, but there are just not enough females on Weird Reform Twitter, and there aren't enough. I think there aren't enough females who are kind of explicitly, consciously reformed. And of course, that's probably the fault of knucklehead reformed men. But we'll all try to do better, I think. So
teamwork makes the dream work.
I heard that somewhere this week. Presby probably has a comment on that.
I do. There was a funny tweet. What was it? He doesn't tweet much, or he's been shadow banned. But F. Bill McMorris once told a story about his wife speaking somewhere overseas, and she used that phrase, and then she saw everyone who was quickly scribbling down the notes as oh wow, this is the most incredible saying we've ever heard, and she had to quickly backtrack that it was not her that came up with the phrase. That it was and said something else, but yeah, I totally use that sentence in a serious, non-ironic manner all the time. It's probably what I say to most people. Tell me all the time. They're so impressed by it. You wouldn't believe the amount of people that I am impressed with it. It's
Nobody's
really
ever
shocking.
seen so many people impressed by it. It was huge.
Well, it's the best.
I tell you,
it's the best people too. Presbycast doesn't. Oh, we don't always send our best, but tonight we did. We sent our best. So, well, I think we'll go ahead, Presby, since we scared all the callers off. Sort of a record number, but again, probably all for the best. I think maybe we'll just go ahead and wrap this thing up.
Well, if we must, I suppose we can. So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks everyone for interacting and coming on. Especially thanks to for so long, and talking, and everyone else who contributed. We're Presbycast. We'll be here again probably next week. We try not to be cyclical, and we certainly don't have seasons of this podcast, but it seems like the summer and about every November, every 4 years or so, things tend to get a little goofier here on the show as we try to give you a little bit reprieve from the idiocy of everything else. So definitely stay tuned for more of that. We're Presbycast. Don't be an Erdman.
Don't be an Erdman.
Don't waste your life, don't toss it away. You can know real life for today. Yield to God, let him have his way. Don't waste your life, my friend. Claim it! You'll lose in the end. And time spreads out its mystic way. Spread before our searching eyes. We peer into the mystic gloom to just see where our path lies. Your future life is uncertain on your own. You need a guide, don't try to go it alone. Don't waste your life, don't toss it away. You can know real life today. Yield to God, let him have his way. Don't waste your life, my friend. You will lose in the end.
Magic on the internet worldwide.
Don't waste your life, don't toss it away.